No one in the ballroom understood why the Duke of Raventon stopped dancing in the middle of the floor. The orchestra continued for a few unsteady notes before the musicians realized something was wrong and allowed the music to thin into a confused hush. Couples slowed their steps. Whispered questions drifted like faint threads of sound across the polished room. The Duke stood perfectly still, his posture taut with purpose. He did not spare a glance for the partner he had just released, nor did he acknowledge the attention gathering around him. Instead, he looked past the clusters of silk-covered figures and jeweled fans, searching for something or someone with an intensity that unsettled the onlookers. His gaze found its mark near the edge of the ballroom. Eleanor Renford stood slightly removed from the crowd, as if such distance had been chosen rather than imposed. Her gown, though appropriate, lacked the brightness of the dresses surrounding her. She held her hands neatly before her and attempted to appear absorbed by the movement of the dancers, though the stiffness in her shoulders betrayed a quiet discomfort. She had not expected to become the focus of anything that evening, least of all the focus of a man whose title commanded more attention than the chandeliers overhead. Yet the Duke walked toward her without pausing to reconsider. Each step he took deepened the confusion spreading through the guests. People shifted aside, first out of courtesy, then out of curiosity, as he passed through the room with unwavering direction. Eleanor noticed him only when the murmurs grew too persistent to ignore. She glanced up, startled, just as he stopped in front of her. "Miss Renford," he said, addressing her with a calm that seemed at odds with the charged silence surrounding them. She blinked once, uncertain whether she had misheard him. She lowered her head in a polite greeting, but the tension in her hands revealed her bewilderment. "Good evening, Your Grace." He studied her for a moment, as though confirming something quietly within himself. Eleanor felt the warmth rise in her cheeks and shifted ever so slightly, hoping the exchange would be brief. Not far from them, Eliza Renford watched the scene with widening eyes. Draped in a gown that shimmered with each movement, she had spent the evening anticipating the Duke's attention, convinced the moment he sought a partner for the next dance, it would be her hand he requested. Yet the man who was expected to admire her had walked directly past her without a word. Her grip on her fan tightened. Her smile, carefully arranged for the benefit of onlookers, wavered, then faltered entirely when she realized the Duke had chosen her sister as the object of his attention. Eleanor, who rarely drew notice. Eleanor, who had not been prepared for such scrutiny. Eleanor, who stood now beneath the weight of countless stares, appearing as uncertain as Eliza felt. The Duke, however, seemed unaffected by the growing tension. He spoke again, his tone low but clear enough to reach those watching with held breath. "I had hoped to greet you earlier," he said, "but the opportunity did not arise." Eleanor swallowed softly, unsure how to respond. Nothing in her experience had prepared her for such direct acknowledgement from a man of his influence. She searched for a suitable reply, yet remained unable to understand what had prompted him to approach her at all. Eliza's gaze sharpened with a mix of confusion and disbelief. She looked around, expecting someone else to react, to question the impropriety of the moment, but the guests remained frozen, watching with thinly veiled fascination. A few exchanged glances that carried the beginnings of speculation. Others leaned forward, eager to interpret the Duke's unexpected choice. Eleanor lifted her eyes briefly, only to find the Duke observing her with a calm steadiness that unsettled her further. His expression was not bold or presumptuous, yet the intensity behind it suggested familiarity, something she did not share. She felt a quiet unease spread through her chest. There was no reason he should greet her with such intention, no history to support the recognition she sensed in his voice. Her confusion must have been visible, because he softened his tone. "I hope my approach has not caused you discomfort." She shook her head gently. "It is only that I did not expect your attention, Your Grace." A faint pause followed. "Perhaps that is why you have it," he replied. The words settled between them, quiet but unmistakable. A ripple moved through the crowd as the implications took shape. Eliza's breath caught, and a sharp ache stirred beneath her ribs. She understood nothing of what connected them, but she recognized the danger of any shift that pulled admiration away from her. The Duke stood unaware of the shock he had ignited. For him, the moment felt inevitable, a continuation of something that had begun long before this evening. For Eleanor, it felt incomprehensible. For Eliza, it felt like a threat she had never imagined facing. The orchestra remained silent. The whispers grew louder, and while Eleanor attempted to gather her composure, her thoughts drifted to the simple truth that she had never once expected to stand in a place where her presence altered the atmosphere of an entire room. She had no way of knowing that the seeds of this moment were planted weeks before, in a quiet corner of life far removed from chandeliers and polished floors. What had begun as an ordinary day had quietly shaped everything now unfolding under society's watchful eyes. The hush that had followed the Duke's unexpected approach lingered in Eleanor's thoughts long after the moment had passed. Yet the confusion she felt did not spring from the ballroom alone. It reached much further back, to the foundations of her life, years shaped not by grand events, but by the subtle differences in how she and her sister were regarded from the moment each entered the world. Eleanor Renford had been born into a household that valued quiet discipline and unobtrusive efficiency. As the first child, she was greeted with gentle pride and a set of expectations that did not require spectacle. Her father, a man of measured temperament, believed in raising a daughter who understood responsibility. He taught her to observe before speaking and to complete every task with patience. Her mother, though affectionate in her own restrained manner, praised diligence far more than charm. Eleanor grew accustomed to earning approval through steadiness rather than delight. Eliza arrived 5 years later, and with her came an entirely different atmosphere. From infancy, she possessed a brightness that drew attention before she could even walk. Visitors who held her cooed at her lively eyes and soft curls, remarking how captivating she would surely become. Her parents, influenced by such observations, responded with unreserved affection. Where Eleanor's childhood had been defined by quiet encouragement, Eliza's was bathed in admiration so constant it shaped the very air she breathed. As the two sisters grew, the distinction between them became more pronounced. Eleanor, thoughtful and patient, preferred books and routine. She took naturally to tasks that required focus, organizing household ledgers, assisting with charitable arrangements, learning the nuances of courteous conversation. She rarely sought praise, and when it came, she accepted it with modest surprise. Eliza, meanwhile, continued to thrive on attention. Compliments followed her effortlessly at family dinners, garden gatherings, and later at smaller social events where young ladies first learned the art of being noticed. Elders praised her appearance, peers admired her confidence, and acquaintances predicted she would one day be the center of every room she entered. She learned to smile with practiced warmth, to tilt her head at just the right angle, and to laugh with a softness that invited admiration. Though their parents never stated it plainly, the unspoken truth settled heavily between the sisters. Eleanor was the responsible one, Eliza was the delightful one. Eleanor belonged to the quiet corners, Eliza belonged to the spotlight. Yet affection existed between them despite these differences. Eleanor often stayed by Eliza's bedside during storms, calming her sister's fears with soft reassurances. Eliza, in turn, slipped handwritten notes beneath Eleanor's door on mornings when she overslept, urging her to come downstairs before breakfast cooled. They shared secrets in the dim glow of nocturnal candlelight, spoke of their hopes, and found comfort in the knowledge that someone understood their private fears. But as adolescence took shape, pressure settled upon Eliza in ways her family did not see. Admiration, once a source of delight, became an obligation she feared losing. She noticed how the world's attention shifted quickly from one novelty to another. She saw younger girls praised with the same excited tones once reserved for her. Every compliment she received carried an unspoken demand: remain exceptional, stay luminous, do not falter. Her self-worth, tied so tightly to praise, felt increasingly fragile. Eleanor sensed the strain more readily than others. She observed the moments when Eliza's smile tightened under scrutiny, when her laughter lacked its natural ease, when she practiced expressions before mirrors with fierce concentration. Eleanor tried in small ways to ease her sister's burden. She complimented Eliza's kindness rather than her beauty. She defended her gently during missteps. She offered moments of quiet companionship that required no performance. But Eleanor could not change the expectations society placed upon someone like Eliza, a young woman whose identity had been shaped by admiration long before she could question it. When the time came for Eliza to enter her first full social season, enthusiasm filled the house. Dresses were chosen with great care, invitations sorted with precision, and whispers of advantageous matches floated through conversations. Their parents anticipated success with certainty. After all, Eliza had always been the star. Eleanor approached the season differently. She did not resent attending, she simply felt no connection to the frenetic excitement surrounding it. She accepted her role in these gatherings with steady composure, knowing her presence balanced Eliza's exuberance. Her parents trusted her to observe necessities, protect reputations, and maintain calm should any crisis arise. This dynamic, Eleanor as the quiet anchor, Eliza as the admired center, had always felt natural to both. but beneath the surface, it created a divide that neither acknowledged openly. Eleanor had grown comfortable being overlooked. Eliza, however, feared even the slightest shift of attention away from her. When the Duke of Raventon entered the season's first major gathering, and his gaze lingered not on Eliza, but on another young lady across the room, Eliza felt the first unfamiliar stir of worry. She noticed the quiet tightening in her chest, the faint chill that came with uncertainty. She pushed the feeling aside, convinced that such admiration belonged to her by right of habit. She had not anticipated that the woman the Duke had searched for was her own sister. The seeds of unease planted that night took root quietly but firmly, and as the season unfolded, the delicate balance between the sisters, the one who carried expectations and the one who avoided them, began to shift in ways neither could have imagined. The season that brought Eleanor and Eliza into the same glittering rooms as the Duke carried with it a history that neither sister could fully see. Eliza believed her confidence and practiced charm would draw the finest attention, while Eleanor assumed her presence would pass unnoticed, just as it always had. What neither of them understood was that the course of events had quietly shifted long before either young woman stepped into the ballroom. The change began on a cool morning several weeks earlier, on a day that held no special significance for anyone but the man who happened to witness it. Eleanor rarely spoke of the moments she spent at St. Aldwyn's orphan school. She visited not out of obligation, nor because it offered recognition, but because she found quiet purpose in helping the children there. The building itself was modest, its stone darkened by the remnants of winter. When she walked through its courtyard, the air carried a faint scent of damp wood and dust. She held a bundle of books close to her body, the corners of their covers softened from use. She preferred to bring only what she thought the children would appreciate, nothing ostentatious, nothing chosen to earn admiration. Inside, the teacher greeted her with a grateful nod before returning to the small class gathered at the front. Eleanor moved to the side table, arranging her books and distributing slate pieces for the younger ones. She did so with an ease shaped by habit. The children responded to her with quiet enthusiasm, recognizing the calm tone she always brought with her. Eleanor knelt beside a girl struggling with her letters, guiding the chalk between the small fingers with gentle patience. She was not aware that the Duke had entered the building moments earlier. Adrian had come to inspect the school because its trustee committee had requested additional funds for repairs. He preferred to make such decisions only after seeing matters firsthand. His steward accompanied him for a brief walk through the main corridor, discussing structural concerns and necessary improvements. Once the conversation turned to bookkeeping and estimates, the steward moved aside to speak privately with the headmaster, leaving Adrian free to walk further into the halls. He had expected a straightforward visit. What he had not anticipated was the unmistakable softness of children reciting their lessons drifting into the otherwise quiet corridor. Something in the sound drew him toward the open doorway. He hesitated for a moment, not wishing to interrupt, and then stepped close enough to see inside. The room held little that could be described as remarkable. The desks were worn, the windows clouded in places, and the chalkboard bore the marks of countless lessons. Yet Adrian's attention fixed immediately on the young woman leaning over one of the desks. Her voice, though quiet, carried a warmth that seemed to settle the restless movement of the children nearby. Her posture conveyed neither effort nor self-consciousness. She simply existed within the moment, offering guidance without expecting acknowledgement. He watched her lift the child's hand slightly, adjusting the angle of the chalk, her expression untroubled and focused. There was nothing rehearsed in her manner. It was this absence of performance that struck Adrian most deeply. He had encountered countless young women in society whose gestures were shaped by the desire to be seen and admired. This woman, by contrast, moved with a sincerity so natural that it gave him pause. He stepped back from the doorway as she rose from the small desk and collected the remaining books from the table. When she turned toward the exit, he retreated a pace to allow her space. She emerged with the books in her arms, unaware of how closely he observed her. Only when she nearly collided with him did she register his presence. The books shifted, and she steadied them carefully. "I'm terribly sorry," she said, adjusting her grip, her voice composed with a hint of embarrassment. She made no dramatic display of fluster, no attempt to turn the mishap into a gesture of charm. Adrian bent to retrieve a book that had slipped slightly, offering it back to her. "You needn't apologize." Colt. She accepted it with a brief nod, her gaze meeting his only for an instant before lowering again. He noted the faint chalk on her fingertips and the subtle crease of her sleeve where she had knelt moments before. Nothing about her suggested preparation for scrutiny, and that made her presence all the more distinct. "Do you teach here?" he asked. "I help whenever they can use an extra pair of hands," she replied. Her tone carried no pride. It was a simple statement of fact. There was a steadiness in her words that captured his attention. Many spoke of charitable work with an air of accomplishment, eager for praise. She offered no such expectation. She simply performed her tasks and moved forward. Before he could extend the conversation further, she offered him a polite farewell and began to walk toward the courtyard. He watched her leave with an unexpected feeling of interruption, as though something meaningful had approached him briefly and then slipped away before he could understand it. As he continued the inspection of the school, Adrian found it increasingly difficult to dismiss the impression she had made. The sound of her guiding voice lingered in his thoughts long after he left the building. He did not know her name. He did not know her family. He could not even describe her appearance with precision, yet the quiet steadiness she carried remained vivid in his mind. In the days that followed, her image returned to him at odd moments during meetings, on horseback rides, in the quiet stretch of evening when he reviewed correspondence. He had encountered countless women across society, yet none had left such an imprint from such a brief exchange. So when he later saw her at the first grand ball of the season, standing apart from the crowd with her familiar reserve, recognition arrived with unmistakable certainty. He had not expected their paths to cross again, yet the memory of her presence found its counterpart in the flesh, as though the earlier moment had only been a quiet beginning. Eleanor, unaware of the effect she had left upon him, assumed he had forgotten the brief encounter entirely. She could not yet understand why he had watched her with such focused calm, nor why the room had fallen silent when he approached her. The origins of that moment rested in a past she had treated as unremarkable, but for Adrian, it had become a quiet turning point long before the ballroom ever noticed them. The ballroom remained lively after the Duke's unexpected approach, but underneath the surface of renewed conversation, a thread of unease lingered. Eleanor stood quietly near the wall, trying to regain her composure after the brief exchange that had unsettled her far more than she wished to admit. She had answered him politely, as any young woman ought, yet she could not reconcile the certainty in his voice with the modest impression she believed she had made in their earlier meeting. When the music resumed, she considered slipping away before her parents returned from their conversations. The thought of remaining under the scrutiny of the room made her chest tighten, but she stayed, unsure whether leaving abruptly would draw even more attention. She steadied herself, hoping the Duke had moved on to greet others, and that the moment would fade unnoticed. Adrian, however, had no intention of allowing the evening to end without speaking to her again. He had observed her reaction closely, her confusion, her nervousness, and the quiet way she attempted to withdraw from the center of attention. Her retreat only confirmed for him what he had sensed during their first meeting. She did not seek admiration, nor did she understand the impression she left upon others. The simplicity of her manner strengthened his resolve. He crossed the ballroom once more, careful not to rush. Several guests intercepted him with polite greetings, offering shallow compliments and inquiring about his plans for the season. He answered them with courtesy but without lingering. His attention returned to Eleanor each time he managed to extricate himself from another conversation. Eliza watched the progression with mounting alarm. Her initial shock had subsided into a restless panic she struggled to conceal. All her life, the admiration of others had come effortlessly. Yet here stood a man whose regard she had confidently assumed, directing his presence towards someone who had never been trained to stand in the light. She kept her fan raised, pretending to study the dancers, though her thoughts were entirely fixed on the developing interaction. Her mother approached her with a soft smile, unaware of the tension tightening Eliza's breath. "Your evening seems pleasant. Has the Duke spoken with you yet?" Eliza forced a nod, though she avoided answering directly. "Not yet," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I am sure the opportunity will arise." She lowered her fan slightly, watching as Adrian reached Eleanor once more. Her mother followed the line of her gaze and blinked in mild surprise. "Oh, is your sister unwell? She appears rather pale." Eliza drew in a breath. "She is simply overwhelmed," she said, though the explanation did little to ease the discomfort rising inside her. She could not understand why he continued returning to Eleanor, nor why her sister showed such discomfort at the attention. Adrian reached Eleanor with a quiet greeting. "I hope the evening has not been too taxing," he said. His tone carried a trace of concern, though he tried not to impose. She lifted her head at the sound of his voice. "It has been unexpected," she admitted. She wished she could have chosen a more proper reply, yet honesty slipped out before she could coat it in social polish. "I did not mean to place you in a difficult position," he said gently. "I realize my speaking to you earlier may have startled you." She looked down briefly. It was simply surprising. I am not accustomed to such attention. He seemed to consider her words carefully. I think you underestimate how naturally you draw one's notice, he replied, though he kept the comment mild enough not to overwhelm her. Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her glove. She could not decide whether the Duke was being polite out of duty or whether he truly meant what he said. She feared assuming too much, knowing the consequences of misplaced interpretation. You are kind, she said quietly, hoping the response was neutral enough to satisfy propriety. Adrian sensed the subtle distance she maintained and recognized that pressing further would only heighten her discomfort. He had no wish to place undue strain upon her. Still, he could not let the opportunity slip entirely. If you would allow it, he said with calm restraint, I would appreciate the chance to speak with you again later in the evening, only when you feel comfortable. Eleanor hesitated, her pulse quickening. She had no desire to be rude, but the awareness of being watched, especially by her sister, made the simple act of agreeing feel perilous. Perhaps, she answered softly, hoping that neither refusal nor acceptance would be held too firmly against her. He inclined his head with understanding. Then I shall not keep you longer now. As he stepped back, Eleanor let out a slow breath, grateful for the respite yet troubled by the uncertainty that followed. She turned toward the nearest pillar to steady herself, only to find Eliza standing closer than she expected, her expression carefully controlled. Eleanor, Eliza said, her tone light but strained. You seem unsettled. Is everything all right? Eleanor offered a small smile. I am fine. The room is simply warm. Eliza watched her closely. Has the Duke spoken to you several times already? Eleanor felt her throat tighten. She did not want to hurt her sister or fuel unnecessary assumptions. He greeted me, yes, she said quietly, perhaps only out of courtesy. Eliza's eyes flickered with something sharp beneath the surface, though she disguised it with a soft laugh. Of course, he is always polite. Yet the false brightness in her voice betrayed her unease. She touched Eleanor's arm lightly, the gesture gentle but tense. If you feel overwhelmed, you should rest in the ante-room. These gatherings can be quite taxing. Eleanor detected the suggestion beneath the concern. I appreciate the advice, she replied, but I will remain a while longer. Eliza nodded slowly, but her thoughts churned. This shift in attention, this deviation from everything she had been led to expect, left her deeply unsettled. She looked again toward the Duke, who now greeted another guest with polite formality, and she realized that his earlier behavior had not been a fleeting courtesy. It held intention. For the first time in her life, admiration was drifting somewhere other than toward her, and that frightened her more than she wished to admit. In the days that followed the ball, Eleanor did her best to convince herself that the Duke's unexpected attention had been nothing more than a moment of courtesy. She reassured herself repeatedly that he had mistaken politeness for interest, and that she ought not allow her thoughts to wander into illusions she could not afford. Yet the memory of his steady voice lingered with quiet persistence. Despite her efforts to dismiss it, the sense of being seen, truly seen, remained with her, unsettling her far more than any admiration she might have received from strangers. She kept to her usual routines, moving through the house with the same unobtrusive grace that had defined her for years. She attended to small duties, assisted her mother with correspondence, and spent part of each afternoon tending to errands that rarely drew notice. If anyone had observed her closely, they might have sensed her inner restlessness, but Eleanor was careful to conceal any sign of turmoil. The last thing she wished was to create tension for her family or raise questions she could not answer. Meanwhile, Adrian found himself unable to ignore the quiet impression she had left upon him. He recognized that forcing attention upon someone unaccustomed to it would only cause discomfort, yet he also knew that letting the moment pass entirely would feel insincere. A connection, however slight, had formed between them, and he wished to approach it thoughtfully rather than abruptly. He waited 2 days before sending a brief message to the Renford household, addressed respectfully to Eleanor's mother. The note expressed gratitude for the pleasant company he had experienced at the recent ball and extended a courteous invitation to a small afternoon gathering hosted by a mutual acquaintance. His intent was subtle. He did not request Eleanor's attendance directly, but the gesture carried enough warmth to leave little doubt of his hope. When the invitation was delivered, Eleanor's mother read it with mild surprise. How thoughtful, she remarked. It would be appropriate for you and Eliza to attend. The gathering will be modest, and the company respectable. Eleanor nodded quietly. She had no justification for declining. Still, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest as she wondered what the Duke's presence might mean for her sister, whose expectations for the season had long been encouraged by their parents and by society itself. Eliza received the news with a smile that appeared bright at first glance, but lacked its usual ease. "Another gathering so soon?" she asked, adjusting the ribbons on her sleeve. "I suppose there is no harm in attending." Her voice was pleasant, but a faint restraint underscored her words. Eliza had attempted for days to convince herself that the Duke's attention toward Eleanor had been an odd, passing moment. The thought that it might signify something deeper made her uneasy, though she refused to entertain the idea openly. When they arrived at the gathering, the room was comfortably filled but not crowded. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting soft light across the walls. Eleanor intended to remain near the refreshments or join a small group of ladies engaged in conversation. She hoped to avoid any situation where she might feel pressured or observed. But Adrian's approach was gentle and deliberate. He waited until she appeared settled, then walked toward her with a composed expression, bowing politely before addressing her. "Miss Renford, I am pleased to see you here." Eleanor inclined her head. "Thank you, Your Grace." He offered no grand gesture, only a steady presence. "I wish to apologize if I caused you discomfort at the ball. It was never my intention to place you in a difficult position." Coat. Her fingers tightened slightly around the cup she held. "There is nothing to apologize for," she said softly. "I was only surprised." "I hope you will allow me the opportunity to speak with you in quieter company," he said. His tone was respectful, free of pressure. "Only if you find the idea agreeable." She hesitated, not because she doubted his sincerity, but because agreeing felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory. Still, it would be inconsistent with her upbringing to deny a polite request without clear reason. "For a short while, yes." He guided her toward a seating area away from the center of the room. Their conversation began simply discussing the weather, the season, and recent events, but as they spoke, he gradually steered their dialogue toward subjects she found more comfortable. He asked about her charitable interests, and she answered with a modest clarity that revealed the quiet depth of her convictions. She did not exaggerate her involvement or seek admiration. She spoke plainly, without embellishment, and that honesty held his attention more than any flourish of charm might have done. Eliza, standing nearby in conversation with two young ladies, observed the scene with careful attention. She noticed the relaxed angle of Adrian's posture, the way he listened closely to Eleanor's words, and the faint change in her sister's expression, something close to ease, though tempered with caution. The sight unsettled her, stirring the same fear that had troubled her at the ball. For years, she had believed her future would unfold naturally, shaped by admiration and the advantages she had always been granted. Her sister's presence, while respected, had never threatened that path. Yet now, with the Duke's quiet interest directed toward Eleanor, Eliza felt as though the ground beneath her was shifting. After a few minutes, she excused herself from the group and approached the pair. She greeted Adrian with her usual brightness, though her voice carried an undertone of urgency. "Your Grace, it is lovely to see you again. I hope you are enjoying the afternoon." He offered her a courteous nod. "Indeed, Miss Eliza, it is a pleasant gathering." Quote. She turned to Eleanor with a smile that did not fully reach her eyes. "Sister, I wondered if you might join Mother for a moment. She was asking for you." Eleanor looked uncertain. "Of course. I shall return shortly." When she walked away, Eliza lowered her gaze briefly before addressing the Duke again. "I imagine the season has kept you busy. I hope you will find time for the larger gatherings next week." Adrian listened politely, but did not extend the conversation. His responses were courteous, yet lacked the easy engagement he had shown with Eleanor. Eliza sensed the difference at once, and the contrast deepened the tension already gathering inside her. For the first time, she worried that admiration alone would not secure the future she had assumed was hers. Eleanor returned home from the afternoon gathering with a sense of disquiet, settling in her chest. The conversation she had shared with the Duke had been gentle, almost soothing, yet it left her with more questions than answers. She could not understand why a man of his position would choose to spend his time speaking with her when he had countless other options. The uncertainty pressed heavily upon her, stirring thoughts she had worked so hard to keep at a distance. Eliza, however, carried a different weight. Though she took care to maintain her poise, the restlessness beneath her outward calm grew stronger with each passing hour. She replayed the afternoon in her mind, focusing on the small details that had unsettled her: the attentive lean of the Duke's posture, the measured way he listened to Eleanor, the soft expression that had appeared on Eleanor's face when she spoke to him. These glimpses troubled her more than she wished to acknowledge. Later that evening, while Eleanor was arranging letters in the study, Eliza entered the room quietly. She hesitated in the doorway for a moment before closing it behind her. Eleanor looked up, surprised by the seriousness in her sister's expression. "May I speak with you?" Eliza asked, her voice softer than usual. "Of course," Eleanor said, placing the letters aside. "Is something the matter?" Eliza crossed the room slowly, her gaze fixed on the floor until she reached the nearest chair. She sat down with unusual stillness, folding her hands in her lap. "I have been thinking about the afternoon," she began, choosing her words carefully. "And about the Duke." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. "What about him?" Eliza lifted her eyes. The brightness she often displayed was muted, replaced by a hesitant vulnerability. "I could not help noticing that he seems interested in speaking with you." Eleanor opened her mouth, then closed it, unsure how to respond. She had sensed something unusual in the Duke's attentiveness, but she had hoped it was not so noticeable as to cause distress. "He was simply being polite," she said, though the uncertainty in her tone made the explanation sound fragile even to her own ears. Eliza shook her head gently. "It was more than that. I could see it." She paused, her throat tightening slightly. "I am not angry with you. I know you did nothing to encourage him, but I must be honest, Eleanor, this season matters to me more than it may appear." The confession startled Eleanor, though she did not show it. "I know it does," she said quietly. "You have been preparing for it since last year." "It is not only that," Eliza continued. "All my life, people have expected certain things from me. They have told me who I should be, what I should become, which paths I ought to follow. Sometimes I fear that if I fail to meet those expectations, I will disappoint everyone, including myself." She turned her head away, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. Eleanor watched her sister with deepening concern. Eliza rarely allowed herself to reveal weakness, and the sight of it tugged at something inside her. "Eliza," Eleanor said gently, "you are not obligated to fulfill anyone's expectations. Your worth does not depend on admiration or attention." Quote. Eliza gave a soft, unsteady laugh. "I wish I could believe that. But you have always had a certain freedom I never felt I possessed. You may choose to be quiet, to observe, to avoid the spotlight, and no one questions your place. If I falter for even a moment, everyone notices." Eleanor felt the sting of the words, not because they were unkind, but because they carried painful truth. She had never considered her reserve a freedom. She had believed it to be a limitation. Yet seeing the strain behind Eliza's brightness forced her to understand that her sister lived beneath a different kind of pressure. "What are you asking of me?" Eleanor asked softly, though she sensed the answer before Eliza spoke. "I need you to step back," Eliza whispered. "I cannot bear the thought of losing the future I have worked toward, especially if it slips away because of something neither of us intended." Eleanor inhaled slowly, steadying herself. "I never meant to interfere. If my presence is making things difficult for you, I will distance myself. But you must understand, I have no desire to compete with you. I have never wished for the kind of attention you receive." Eliza nodded, relief and guilt mingling in her expression. "I know. That is why I came to you. You have always been the one person I could speak honestly to." Eleanor reached out to take her sister's hand. "I will do what I can," she promised. "I do not wish to cause you distress." Quote. When Eliza left the room, Eleanor remained seated in silence, her thoughts tangled. It troubled her deeply that her sister felt so threatened. It troubled her even more that withdrawing from the Duke might hurt him, though she knew she had no right to consider that possibility. Her priority, she reminded herself, must be her family's harmony and her sister's peace. Whatever happened must not inflame tensions between them. The next time she saw Adrian, her demeanor shifted. She greeted him with quiet reserve, offering conversation that remained polite yet distant. Adrian noticed the difference immediately. The warmth she had shown during their earlier exchange had faded, replaced by a barrier he could not quite name. He observed her carefully, sensing the subtle retreat, though she offered no explanation. When he attempted to ease into familiar conversation, she answered with brevity. When he suggested walking with her through the room, she declined with delicate courtesy. Adrian felt the change with growing concern. It was not the instinctive discomfort of someone overwhelmed by attention. He had seen that before. This was deliberate withdrawal, chosen with care, as though she were trying to protect something or someone. He found himself wondering whether someone had spoken to her, and if so, with what intention. He glanced across the room and noticed Eliza watching them closely, her expression composed yet alert. Something in the way she observed her sister suggested a quiet urgency, a strain hidden behind her practiced smile. Adrian realized, with a tightening in his chest, that there were dynamics between the sisters he did not yet understand. But he also understood that he could not allow the distance Eleanor created to settle without seeking clarity. Something had changed, and he intended to discover what it was. Eleanor's withdrawal created a subtle shift in the days that followed. She kept her distance from gatherings where she might encounter the Duke, offering her family polite explanations that carried just enough truth to avoid suspicion, yet the restraint cost her more than she admitted. She moved through her routines with a steadiness that felt increasingly hollow, as though each step required deliberate effort. Eliza, sensing her sister's attempt to step aside, felt the turmoil inside her ease slightly, though not completely. The fear that had taken root did not vanish simply because Eleanor retreated. It lingered with a cautious, uneasy presence. Meanwhile, the Duke grew more troubled by the change. Each time he attempted to approach Eleanor, she answered him with careful courtesy, her warmth replaced by a distance he could not reconcile with their earlier conversations. He began to notice small details he had overlooked before the quick lift of her eyes before she looked away, the stiffness in her posture, the hesitation in her speech. It was clear that something weighed upon her, yet she offered him no opportunity to understand. One afternoon, during a gathering hosted by a family acquaintance, the situation took a harsher turn. Eleanor had attended reluctantly, hoping her presence would go largely unnoticed. She kept to the edges of the room, speaking briefly with a few young women she knew. She carried herself with quiet composure, though her thoughts remained troubled. She had not expected to hear anything out of the ordinary, but the atmosphere shifted subtly as she moved through the crowd. Two women standing near the refreshment table lowered their voices abruptly when she approached, glancing at her with expressions too carefully neutral to be sincere. Eleanor offered a polite greeting and continued on, assuming she had interrupted a private conversation. Yet the same pattern repeated several times that afternoon: abrupt silence, sidelong looks, and soft whispers that dissolved whenever she came near. A mild confusion stirred in her chest, but she shrugged it off, determined not to draw conclusions without evidence. Still, the tension in the room clung to her like a faint chill. The truth reached her only when another young woman, a distant acquaintance known for her forthrightness, approached her with an uneasy expression. "Miss Eleanor," she said hesitantly, "I thought you should know. There has been a rumor circulating. I do not believe it myself, but others might." Eleanor froze. "A rumor?" she asked quietly. "What kind of rumor?" The young woman lowered her gaze. "Some have been saying that you entertain a private attachment to someone of lower standing. A man employed at your family's estate." Eleanor's breath caught. "That is entirely untrue." "I assumed as much," the woman said quickly. "But these things spread quickly, and there are those who enjoy speaking ill of others without concern for facts." Eleanor struggled to steady her voice. "Do you know where it began?" The woman hesitated, then shook her head. "I cannot say with certainty, only that it has traveled swiftly." Eleanor thanked her, though the words felt distant and strange. She stepped back from the conversation, her pulse unsteady. The accusation was false, senseless, and cruel. She had lived her life carefully, avoiding impropriety, not because she feared scandal, but because she valued integrity. To be painted as someone who acted without honor struck deeply at her sense of self. She tried to compose herself, but the ache in her chest refused to ease. Eliza, standing across the room, saw the subtle collapse of her sister's expression. She recognized the signs of hurt immediately, and a sharp bolt of guilt pierced her. She had not created the rumor, but she knew its origin indirectly. Several nights earlier, in a moment of desperation, she had confided in a friend that she feared losing her chance with the Duke to her sister. She had spoken carelessly, hinting that Eleanor might harbor feelings for someone unsuitable, too distressed to consider how easily such words could twist when carried away by gossiping tongues. She had regretted it almost immediately, but by the time she attempted to correct herself, the whispers had already spread. Now, seeing the damage she had caused, her stomach knotted painfully. She wanted to approach Eleanor, to confess the truth, but her fear held her back. What if Eleanor rejected her? What if she realized how fragile Eliza truly was? The consequences of honesty felt unbearable. The Duke arrived at the gathering later than expected, appearing calm but keenly observant. He moved through the room with polite composure, though his attention shifted quickly toward Eleanor the moment he saw her. He noticed the faint rigidity in her posture, the way she folded her hands tightly together, the slight tremor in her breath when she greeted him. "Miss Renford," he said softly, "are you unwell?" She forced a smile. "I am quite fine, Your Grace, only a little fatigued." Her words lacked conviction. Adrian's concern deepened. He observed the hushed conversations around them, the glances that darted in her direction, the stiffness that seemed to follow her wherever she moved. A slow realization began to form, unwelcome and troubling. "Something has distressed you," he said quietly. "I can see it." Eleanor shook her head. "It is nothing of consequence." He studied her in silence for a moment, recognizing the effort she put into shielding her emotions. The restraint she displayed was not the same as usual. It carried the weight of wounded dignity. "If the cause of your discomfort is a matter of rumor," he said gently, "I hope you will not bear it alone. Such things should be met with truth, not quiet suffering." Her eyes widened slightly at his insight. She had not spoken a word of the rumor to anyone else. The fact that he had sensed it unsettled her, but also pierced through her composure with a warmth she wished she did not feel. She looked away, unable to maintain the conversation. Adrian's expression hardened slightly, not with anger at her, but at the unseen forces causing her distress. He realized then that someone had deliberately targeted her reputation. The thought stirred a quiet fury within him. He had witnessed enough of society's cruelty to recognize when a vulnerable person had been singled out. Eliza watched the exchange from a distance, her composure thinning. She saw the Duke step closer to Eleanor with gentle resolve, offering support she herself had not been able to give. The realization stung deeply. She had hoped that stepping back would restore the balance of attention she once enjoyed, but instead, her guilt grew heavier. The rumor she had allowed to form was no longer something she could ignore, and the Duke's growing protectiveness of Eleanor threatened to expose the truth. The tension stirred by the rumor did not fade with the evening. Eleanor carried it home like an unwelcome shadow, settling into the quiet corners of her thoughts with a heaviness that refused to lift. She did not speak of it during supper, nor did she hint at her distress when her mother asked whether the gathering had been pleasant. Instead, she excused herself early, retreating to her room under the pretense of fatigue. Alone, she tried to convince herself that the unkind whispers would soon be forgotten. Yet the words continued to echo sharply in her memory. Adrian returned to his residence with a steadiness that belied the turmoil within him. He had seen enough moments at the gathering to know that something deeply unjust had occurred. It was not merely a quiet rumor. It carried the unmistakable intention of harming someone undeserving of such treatment. He could not ignore the concern that weighed upon him, concern sharpened by the growing realization that Eleanor might be withdrawing because of pressures placed upon her by someone close. He resolved to visit the Renford home the next day under the guise of returning a book he had mentioned in conversation. It was a small enough excuse to justify a call, yet it served a deeper purpose. He wished to understand what troubled her and why she refused to confide in him. When he arrived the following afternoon, he found the household in a state of subdued busyness. A maid led him to the drawing room, where she informed him that Miss Eleanor would be called shortly. Adrian waited in silence, turning the book in his hand, uncertain whether she would greet him with the quiet reserve she had shown recently, or with the warmth he remembered from their earlier conversations. Eleanor entered a moment later, her expression polite but guarded. "Your Grace," she said softly, "I did not expect a visit." "I hoped you would allow it," he replied. "I brought the book we discussed." She accepted it with careful hands. "You are very kind." Her tone carried no openness, only a delicate courtesy that stung him more than he wished to admit. He watched her for a long moment before speaking again. "Miss Renford," he began gently, "there is something I feel I must ask, though I worry it may place you in an uncomfortable position." Quote. She stiffened slightly. "You need not trouble yourself. There is nothing I cannot manage alone." "I am not convinced of that," he said. "Something has changed since the first time we spoke. I fear that you may be enduring unkindness in silence." Eleanor's breath faltered. She did not answer immediately, nor did she meet his gaze. Instead, she clasped the book closer to her chest, as though seeking refuge in the familiar feel of its cover. "I do not wish to burden you," she finally said. "It is better if I keep my distance. I do not want to create complications." "Complications for whom?" Adrian asked softly. Before she could form a response, the drawing room door opened. Eliza stepped inside, her expression composed yet unmistakably tense. She halted upon seeing the two of them together, surprise flickering in her eyes. "I did not realize you had a caller," she said, forcing a smile. "I hope I am not interrupting." Adrian studied her carefully. Something in her manner confirmed his suspicion that she knew more than she wished to reveal. "Not at all," he said, though his tone carried a firmness that made her pause. "In fact, your presence may help clarify a matter of concern." Eliza's fingers tightened around the edge of her sleeve. "Clarify?" Eleanor turned to her sister, sensing the danger of the moment. "Eliza," she said quietly, "please." Adrian stepped forward slightly. "Miss Eliza, forgive me for speaking so directly, but I believe you may understand the origin of the rumors currently targeting your sister." Eliza froze, her face paling. "Rumors?" she echoed, though the word trembled with guilt. Eleanor shook her head quickly. "Your Grace, this is unnecessary. I do not wish to discuss it." "But it concerns your reputation," he replied gently. "You should not be left to endure this alone." Eliza swallowed hard. In the stillness that followed, the weight of her actions pressed upon her with crushing clarity. She looked down, unable to withstand either of their gazes. "I never meant for things to go so far," she whispered, her voice straining against the emotion rising in her chest. I only said something carelessly. I did not realize what would happen." Eleanor felt her heart tighten. "Eliza," she murmured, "what did you say?" Elisa's eyes glistened. "I told someone that you might have feelings for someone unsuitable. I was upset and frightened, and I spoke without thinking. I didn't imagine it would turn into gossip. I didn't want people to hurt you. I only wanted to protect my chances with the Duke." Eleanor's breath left her in a quiet gasp. She stepped back, shaken not by anger, but by the sorrow in her sister's admission. "Eliza, why didn't you come to me?" "I was ashamed," Eliza whispered. "You always seem so serene, as though nothing can disturb you. I thought if I told you the truth, you would look at me with disappointment. I couldn't bear that." Adrian listened with growing understanding. He saw now the strained balance between the sisters, the fear behind Eliza's brightness, the compassion behind Eleanor's restraint. He waited until Eliza fell silent before speaking. "Miss Eliza," he said calmly, "your honesty now is important, but you must understand the consequences of letting others speak falsehoods about your sister." Eliza nodded, wiping at her eyes. "I know. I have been miserable with guilt." Eleanor softened. She stepped closer and touched her sister's arm gently. "You should have told me. I would never cast you aside. You are my sister." Eliza trembled under the kindness. "I did a terrible thing. I didn't realize how easily my fear could turn into harm." Quote, Adrian looked at both sisters with steady conviction. "This situation can still be corrected," he said, "but the truth must be acknowledged. Miss Eleanor should not suffer for your silence." Eleanor exhaled slowly, her heart burdened by conflicting emotions, pain, compassion, protectiveness. She took her sister's shaking hand. "We will find a way to mend this," she said softly, "together." And for the first time, Eliza believed her. The days that followed the difficult conversation between the three of them passed with a tension neither sister could fully dispel. Although the truth had been spoken, and the wound acknowledged, the consequences of the rumor continued to ripple through the season. Invitations arrived with the same regularity as before, yet Eleanor found herself hesitating more often when deciding whether to attend. She feared encountering the lingering whispers and dreaded the possibility of being questioned about matters she preferred to forget. Still, she accepted the next major invitation out of obligation, knowing her presence was expected. Eliza prepared for the evening with a heaviness that contrasted sharply with her typical enthusiasm. Though she did her best to hide it, the guilt she carried made every detail, every ribbon, every jewel, every curl pinned carefully into place, feel like armor she no longer wished to wear. The realization that she had harmed her sister weighed upon her constantly. She hoped that by presenting herself with grace, she might avoid drawing further attention to the rift she had caused. The Duke arrived at the same event with a clear resolve. He had spent the preceding days considering how best to counter the harm done to Eleanor's reputation, but he knew that defense in private would not be enough. The rumor had taken root among the very people who shaped society's perception. To protect Eleanor fully, he needed to address it where the damage had occurred, in public, without ambiguity. The dartique hosted by the Montforts was one of the most anticipated of the season. The ballroom was filled with an array of guests whose attire glittered beneath the soft glow of countless chandeliers. Laughter and animated conversation filled the air, yet beneath the polished atmosphere ran the subtle undercurrent of curiosity that always accompanied gatherings of notable size. People observed one another with careful interest, ready to seize upon any moment that might later become the topic of drawing-room discussion. Eleanor entered the room quietly alongside her parents and sister. Though her attire was elegant, she carried herself with modest restraint. She hoped to blend into the background, to endure the evening without confronting the remnants of the falsehood that had followed her. The memory of her sister's tearful confession still lingered in her heart, softening her anger, yet leaving her uncertain of how to navigate the social sphere that had judged her so swiftly. Eliza walked slightly ahead, attempting to maintain the dignified poise expected of her. Her eyes scanned the room with caution. The memory of her misstep threatened her confidence, and she feared encountering those who may have heard the gossip she had inadvertently unleashed. Though she wished desperately to support her sister, she knew any overt display might provoke speculation she was not prepared to face. Adrian noticed the sister's arrival almost immediately. His posture straightened, and a calm purpose settled over him. He moved through the room with deliberate steps, greeting acquaintances with brief nods before making his way toward Eleanor. Guests noticed the direction of his movement. Their conversations softened, replaced by the murmuring curiosity that often preceded social upheaval. Eleanor saw him approach and felt a familiar flutter of unease. She respected him deeply, perhaps more deeply than she dared to admit, but she worried that continued association would only fuel the attention she wished to avoid. Yet the sincerity in his expression made it impossible to retreat. "Miss Renford," he said gently when he reached her, "may I speak with you for a moment?" She nodded with quiet reluctance. "Of course, Your Grace." He glanced briefly at her parents, offering a courteous greeting before turning his full attention back to her. "I hope you will forgive the directness of this question," he began, "but have you still been troubled by the rumors?" Eleanor's eyes lowered to the floor. "I have attempted to ignore them." "That should not be necessary," he replied. "You deserve better than silent endurance." She felt her breath tighten but said nothing. Adrian hesitated only briefly before continuing. "I believe there is only one way to bring an end to the matter, and I intend to address it tonight." Eleanor looked up, startled. "Your Grace, that is not necessary. I do not wish to cause a scene." "This is not about creating a scene," he said calmly. "It is about restoring truth." She tried to protest, but he gently raised his hand to silence her. "I assure you my intentions are sincere." Before she could respond, the music softened and the room shifted as guests moved toward the center of the floor. The host announced the commencement of the evening's first formal dance, inviting those who wished to take their places. Adrian turned toward Eleanor, offering his hand. "Would you permit me the honor?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated, aware of the countless eyes waiting to interpret her next step, but she also sensed that refusing him would carry its own weight. She placed her hand in his, her fingers trembling slightly, and allowed him to lead her toward the center of the room. Eliza watched from the perimeter, her face composed yet shadowed by worry. She had feared this moment, though she did not fully understand what the Duke intended. She felt torn between admiration for her sister's quiet bravery and fear that the evening might end in a way that exposed her own guilt. As Adrian and Eleanor stepped into the open space, the whispers around them intensified. The attention that Eleanor had wished to avoid now settled directly upon her, heavy and unyielding. Yet the Duke's presence beside her steadied her in a way she had not expected. His posture was confident, his expression calm, as though he had prepared himself for exactly this. The room quieted gradually as guests recognized that something unusual was taking place. Adrian's voice carried with serene conviction. "Before we begin," he said loud enough for those nearby to hear but not forcefully, "there is something I must say." Eleanor's heart raced. She gripped the edges of her gloves, unable to look anywhere but at the floor. Adrian lifted her hand gently. "Some of you may have heard unkind rumors concerning Miss Eleanor Renford," he continued, his tone steady. "I say this plainly, there is no truth in them, and I hope for the sake of fairness that all here will choose integrity over idle talk." The silence deepened. A few gasps echoed softly around the room. "And," he added, turning slightly so that his voice reached further, "to eliminate any doubt about where my regard lies, let it be known that I hold Miss Renford in the highest esteem." Eleanor felt the air catch in her chest. She wanted to step back, but found she could not move. Eliza felt the words pierce her, carrying both the pain of truth and the unexpected relief of having the burden finally confronted. She pressed a hand lightly to her chest, steadying her breath as she realized that the path she had clung to so desperately was slipping away entirely. The Duke's declaration hung in the air, irrevocable and undeniable, and the eyes of the room curious, startled, whispering shifted from judgment to astonished respect. The aftermath of the Duke's declaration lingered long after the guests resumed their conversations. The atmosphere of the ballroom had transformed, where whispers of scandal once rippled through the crowd. A different kind of murmur now followed Eleanor. People approached her parents with warm inquiries, spoke of integrity, and noted the Duke's remarkable candor. Yet Eleanor herself felt suspended somewhere between disbelief and gratitude. unsure how to navigate the sudden shift in attention. When the dance finally began, she allowed Adrian to guide her across the floor. He moved with reassurance, his steps steady, his focus unwavering. Eleanor struggled to quiet the turmoil inside her: fear, wonder, relief, and a fragile sense of hope, all mingled into something she had never felt before. She lifted her gaze just once to look at him, and the quiet sincerity in his eyes made her breath falter. "You did not have to speak so boldly," she murmured. He met her gaze with calm certainty. "I could not remain silent while you endured harm that was undeserved, and I will not pretend that my regard for you is anything less than genuine." Eleanor lowered her eyes, overwhelmed by the depth of his words. She did not answer right away, afraid that expressing her own feelings would reveal too much, yet the warmth in her chest made it impossible to deny that something within her had begun to shift. At the edge of the room, Eliza watched them with a stillness that surprised even herself. The sharp sting she had once felt when seeing her sister in such a place softened into something quieter, something closer to humility than jealousy. She realized the bitterness she carried had been born not from her sister's presence, but from her own fear of inadequacy. Seeing Eleanor on the dance floor, steady yet modest, she recognized that her sister had never tried to outshine her. It had only ever been Eliza's own reflection she grappled with. When the evening finally drew to a close, Eleanor and Eliza rode home together in a silence, broken only by the gentle rattle of the carriage wheels. Eleanor stared out the window, still replaying the Duke's declaration in her mind, while Eliza sat with her hands folded tightly, gathering the courage she needed to speak. "Eleanor," she said softly. Eleanor turned. "Yes? I want to say something properly," Eliza continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I hurt you, and I have been trying to make sense of why. I now understand that I allowed fear to guide me. I feared losing something I believed belonged to me, and in doing so, I nearly lost the person who mattered more than any attention I could ever receive." The sincerity in her voice made Eleanor's throat tighten. "I forgave you the moment you told me the truth," she replied, "but I am glad to hear these words." Eliza managed a faint, unsteady smile. "I hope you will not think me weak for admitting it." "I think you are brave for doing so," Eleanor answered. Eliza's eyes warmed with relief. She leaned lightly against her sister's shoulder, a gesture reminiscent of their childhood. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt something gentle pass between them, an unspoken vow to mend what had been strained. The next morning, the Duke arrived at the Renford home with a request that surprised no one who had seen his behavior the previous night. He asked to speak with Eleanor privately, and with her mother's permission, she joined him in the winter garden, where the pale light filtered through glass panes and settled softly on the greenery. Adrian stood with an expression that mingled anticipation and composed resolve. "Miss Renford," he began, "I ask for your patience as I say what I have wished to say for some time." Eleanor felt her heart quicken. She clasped her hands carefully before her, waiting. "I have admired your character from the first moment I encountered it," he said, "not because of charm or performance, but because of your sincerity. Your humility, your compassion, and your quiet resilience have shown me a strength I value deeply. I do not wish to make assumptions about your feelings, but I cannot ignore my own any longer." He paused, ensuring she could withdraw if she wished. "I would be honored," he continued, "if you would consider becoming my wife." The words hung in the air with gentle gravity. Eleanor felt warmth flood her chest, and yet she also felt the weight of responsibility she carried toward her family, toward her sister, and toward her own uncertainty. "I do not know if I am suited to the role of a duchess," she said honestly. Adrian stepped closer, his voice steady. "I am not seeking perfection, nor do I want a partner shaped by society's expectations. I want you, as you are." Eleanor lifted her gaze, and in that moment, the doubts that had shadowed her heart eased. She understood that he did not choose her to fill a place beside him. He chose her because she had already filled a place within him. With a quiet breath, she answered, "Yes, I will marry you." Relief and joy softened his expression, and for the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to smile openly in his presence. News of their engagement spread quickly, and though there were murmurs of surprise, there was also admiration for the honesty the Duke had shown throughout the ordeal. Eleanor's reputation, once threatened, now stood strengthened by the very integrity she had displayed. As for Eliza, she made a decision that surprised her family. She requested to spend a season in Bath with her aunt, seeking time away from London's social demands. "I need space to understand myself without the noise of expectations," she told Eleanor. Her sister embraced her, proud of her courage. During her time away, Eliza found companionship in unexpected places, conversations free of judgment, friendships unburdened by comparison, and eventually, a gentle courtship with a man who admired her sincerity more than her beauty. She discovered a kind of peace she had never known, one built on authenticity rather than applause. Months passed, and Eleanor's wedding to Adrian took place in a modest but heartfelt ceremony, attended only by those closest to them. Eliza returned to stand as her sister's witness, no longer overshadowed by envy but brightened by the quiet self-assurance she had gained. When Eleanor walked down the aisle, Adrian's expression held the same steady warmth he had shown from the start, reflecting a bond not built on spectacle, but on mutual respect and genuine affection. In the years that followed, both sisters found their own forms of happiness. Eleanor, once overlooked, thrived in a role shaped not by grandeur, but by gentle leadership. Eliza, freed from the weight of unrealistic expectations, built a life that allowed her to be cherished for her true nature. And in the end, the story of the two sisters, and the man whose heart had been captured by sincerity rather than spectacle, became a quiet testament to the strength found in authenticity, forgiveness, and love that grows steadily rather than suddenly.